Along the same lines, however, you brought up, and we're going to take a quick pause of industry news to talk about this particular article from the Register. Um, but basically, it was, I don't know, an analysis, I guess, of open source licensing and its evolution in the enterprise state. And we're talking about it right now because they specifically in this article called out three projects, one of which was HashiCorp's Terraform. And really, the point of this article is that as organizations that are for-profit entities that own the rights, or so to speak, of the open source, I don't even know how to say that, whether the sponsors or whatever of these open source projects, that they end up often having some conflicts as they attempt to monetize and come under pressure to deal with it. So why did you share this, and what was your sort of thought processes around it?
Yeah, so the Register took a quick look at the State of OpenCon 2025 keynote done by Dr. Dawn Foster. And she pointed out that there were some interesting shifts going on here with open source increasingly, as we're seeing kind of the split between open source that is in practice maintained by a single vendor versus open source that is supported by a maintainer community or some sort of organization that is made of a multiple companies or multiple maintainers, and seeing how some of these major open source tools, so Terraform is mentioned, Redis is mentioned, Elastic Search is mentioned, have been forked off by maintainers that want a more independent or less vendor focused solution. Yeah, and so this seems to be a kind of split that is happening in the open source world. So all these solutions may still be open source, but now you have to look at the maintainer community or communities involved associated with the tool to see which one really fits kind of the open source philosophy that we typically consider to be open.
What I think is interesting about this is that I don't think this is entirely new. I feel like this has been an ongoing thing for a number of years, and I always found interesting as an analyst when I would meet with a company that was doing a briefing and they would talk about they were in fact open source.
Mhm.
Um, Yet they were a for-profit entity. They were not this community project. I always thought it was interesting that because it's a very conflicted go-to-market model, right? When you are doing that, I'm um, less suspect of a company like AWS that simply takes it and takes an open source project and says we're going to deploy this and support it and whatever. It's
Mhm.
still open source or whatever. But I look at this and say, at the end of the day, it's sort of a non well, I guess there's two ways of looking at it. But if you're a CIO, this is all sort of academic because you're going to go with a company to maintain support it in general. It's very rare that a CIO of an enterprise organization is going to take a true open source product and truly take the open source version of it and manage it on their own. So, for them, it just sort of pushes it. I think the real question here is is there value? And I think this is to me the core question that this article and this doctor is trying to make. Is there actually value in an open source project that is predominantly driven by and supported by a company? Or are they simply doing the sort of hand waving of saying we're open source, but for all intents and purposes, it's just another product? And that's I think the interesting question about it.
Mhm.
And I don't know if there's an answer or if it even matters from your perspective.
I think it's an interesting problem because a couple of the comparisons made here are with Elasticsearch being forked off by Amazon and which created OpenSearch. But there, AWS is obviously a strong corporate sponsor for a project. Whereas if you look at, say, HashiCorp Terraform forking off OpenTofu, that's supported by Foundation, which may be okay, but then you're starting to deal with a more diverse set of contributors and wondering which aspects of the project will be maintained over time. And it's been interesting to see how this open source maintenance has been supported. We're starting to see companies like Tidelift show up. Tidelift is a company that literally exists to map individual contributors and maintenance maintainers at the open source level with projects that may be unmanaged, and making sure
Yeah.
that that is being bridged when you don't have a large corporate sponsor in place.
I mean, the way I look at this is I sort of feel, and the lines blur, particularly if you get into the really large enterprises. But the way I look at this is, if you're a CIO, you're going to be focused on these projects that you're buying AWS OpenSearch, or you're buying the stuff that is supported by the company, because it's
Mhm.
at the end of the day, that's really what you're buying. What I think is interesting is where I think the community projects are much more valuable and supportable is when it's a core technology that is predominantly used by the hyperscalers or by the large cloud providers or whomever, because they have a vested interest in having sort of this common platform. They can all contribute resources. They have resources, they can afford to contribute it. It makes a lot of sense. And I
Mhm.
think that's where this starts to break down. And so I sort of think from an CIO's perspective, this is sort of an academic thing, but I think it's useful to bring up, to be aware of, because we
Mhm.
always have to be concerned about the future roadmap of products and projects, and making sure that we don't get left in a bind.